Today, we are going to get into the absolutely dramatic story behind one of the most influential documents in the entire world, the U.S. Constitution. And it wasn't born out of some calm, quiet reflection. Oh no, it was forged in crisis, shaped by fierce debate, and in the end, built on some incredibly hard-won compromise. But before we dive into the Constitution itself, let's start with a really basic question. Just think about it for a second. What do you think is the number one most fundamental job of any government? Is it protecting its people, building a strong economy, making sure things are fair and just?
Well, that very question was basically haunting the newly independent United States back in the 1780s. And honestly, they weren't doing a great job of answering it. Which brings us right to our first section, a nation teetering on the brink.
So America had won its freedom, which was amazing, but now it was facing a brand new, terrifying problem. What do you do when the government you created to avoid being a monarchy is actually so weak that it just can't function? What happens when it all starts to fall apart?
This right here was the crisis. The year is 1787, and this famous cartoon, well, it just captures the mood perfectly. The message was blunt, it was stark, and it was clear. Join or die. The states were acting like these separate, squabbling pieces of a snake, and the entire American experiment, it was on the verge of complete collapse.
So where did all this chaos come from? Well, the source was the country's first attempt at a constitution, called the Articles of Confederation. And let me tell you, it was fundamentally broken. The central government had no money, because it literally had no power to tax anyone. So the army wasn't getting paid, soldiers were leaving. Huge debts to countries in Europe were just sitting there, unpaid. And get this, with no joint army, each state was basically on its own. The nation was dangerously weak, and its survival was a real question.
It was pretty clear that something had to be done, and fast. And that urgency led to a secret, super high-stakes meeting, the Philadelphia Convention.
Okay, so in May of 1787, delegates from the states all gather in Philadelphia. Now, their official job was pretty simple. Just fix the Articles of Confederation. But it only took a few days of talking for them to come to this really radical conclusion. The Articles were a lost cause. They had to scrap the whole thing and start from scratch with a brand new constitution.
And to really get the gravity of what they were doing, you have to understand this. The entire convention was held in total secrecy. I'm talking doors locked, windows nailed shut, all during a blistering hot Philadelphia summer. But that secrecy was absolutely essential. It meant the delegates could argue, they could debate fiercely, and they could even change their minds without having to worry about what the public would think. So here was the massive challenge they were up against. Their goal was to walk this incredibly fine line. They needed to create a government that was strong enough to actually unite the country, manage the economy, defend the borders, but not so powerful that it would crush the very freedoms they had just fought a revolution to win. A real tightrope walk. And that tension, that constant tug-of-war between power and liberty, it created this huge split. It defined the entire convention, really, and it broke the delegates down into two main camps, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
So you had these two groups. On one side, you have the Federalists. They wanted a strong central government. They believed federal laws needed to be the supreme law of the land to hold everything together. On the other side were the Anti-Federalists. They were terrified of a powerful central government, fearing it would become just like the monarchy they'd escaped. They wanted the states to hold most of the power, and they flat out opposed the new Constitution unless it included a Bill of Rights.
James Madison, who was a key Federalist, he put their argument pretty bluntly. He said, without the substance of this power, the whole Constitution would be a dead letter. Basically, for him, a government without real power isn't a government at all. It's just words on paper. But the Anti-Federalists, they saw a huge danger. Robert Yates, an Anti-Federalist from New York, he warned that this new powerful government would just swallow up all the powers of the state governments. They were really afraid of losing control to some distant, all-powerful authority. The whole convention almost fell apart because of this disagreement, especially when it came to how states would be represented in the new government. The thing that saved the Constitution was this brilliant bit of political deal-making that we now call the Great Compromise.
And here's how it worked. It was actually pretty clever. This compromise created a two-house legislature. First, you get the House of Representatives. There, the number of representatives you get is based on your state's population. That made the big states happy. But then, you get the Senate, where every single state, no matter how big or small, gets exactly 2 senators. And that protected the power of the small states. It was the breakthrough they absolutely had to have.
Okay, so with that major crisis averted, the framers could finally get down to business designing the actual machinery of the government. They were creating a detailed blueprint for how this new nation would work.
And to make sure no single person or group got too powerful, they split the government's job into 3 separate branches. You can see it right there in the first 3 articles of the Constitution. Article 1 creates the legislative branch. That's Congress. Their job is to make the laws. Article 2 creates the executive branch, the president, to carry out those laws. And Article 3 creates the judicial branch, the courts, to interpret the laws. A separation of powers.
But the framers weren't naive. They were realists. They knew they couldn't possibly predict every single challenge the future would hold. So they did something brilliant. They built in a way for the Constitution to change, creating a document that could actually evolve over time.
The very first evolution, and probably the most famous one, came right out of that big debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. To get the Constitution passed, the Federalists had to promise they would add a list of protections for individual freedoms. And the result of that promise? The Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments, and they secure those fundamental liberties the Anti-Federalists fought so hard for.
And this idea is what makes the Constitution a living document. This ability to amend it has let the country adapt for centuries. Think about it. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. In 1920, the 19th Amendment finally gave women the right to vote. And in 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. See? The Constitution was never meant to be frozen in amber. It was designed to change as the nation itself changed.
So, when you boil it all down, the Constitution was a practical solution to a moment of deep crisis. But its real genius isn't just what it said in 1787. It's that it was built to change. It was designed to last, not by being rigid, but by being flexible. And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. What are the new challenges with technology in our society around the world that are going to test its adaptability next?